So here in Chapter 4, we're going to use our supply and demand framework that we developed in Chapter 3 to do some analysis. Right? We're going to look at price controls, taxes, subsidies, different aspects of taxes. Basically, we're going to use supply and demand to analyze different aspects of government intervention in markets. Okay, so we're reading through Chapter 4 of the textbook here, and we're going to go through price controls, and in the context of going through price controls, we're going to talk about surplus and shortage. Okay. After we finish that up, we're going to move on to taxes. Then we'll talk about the Laffer curve. That's kind of an idea that relates to tax revenue and tax rates. And lastly, subsidies. We'll also talk about some other key topics around taxes and price controls, right? We'll look at what happens when the government imposes different controls in markets. Right? We know sometimes people try to get around those, right? So those are things we call black markets or informal markets. So we'll kind of take a look at all those aspects of markets. Okay, but first up, we're going to dive into price controls. So, what are price controls? Okay, well, they're basically when a government intervenes and sets a maximum or minimum price in a market. Okay, so we know in a market that when buyers and sellers interact, they tend to move towards equilibrium price, right? And that was what we talked about back in Chapter 3. It's this nice aspect of markets. Total surplus is maximized, okay? But in certain markets, sometimes the government decides that they don't like that particular equilibrium price. It's either too high or it's too low, right? Now, in other countries, you might tend to see more price controls. Here in the United States, we really don't have that many price controls. Minimum wage laws are an example of price controls. Agricultural price floors are also sometimes used. Also, anti-gouging laws after a natural disaster, another example of a price control. But for the most part, most markets don't really have price controls, okay? But there's a few that do, and there's some historical examples that we can kind of go through. Now, as you'll see as we go through them, price controls are messy, right? There are some consequences, right? And the consequences can sometimes not be so nice, okay? And so this is why, for the most part, in most markets here in the United States, we don't really see too many price controls because they do have consequences. Like we talked about in Chapter 3, total surplus is maximized when the market reaches its equilibrium outcome. If you try to deviate from that, you get some problems, okay? And so that's what we'll look at here as we dive into price controls. All right, so what is a price control? A price control is when the government uses a regulation, force of law, somehow passes some law or regulation that sets a maximum or a minimum price, okay? All right, so a minimum price, this is what we call a price floor. Price floor. And a maximum price, this is what we call a price ceiling. Okay? So it seems straightforward enough. Minimum is a floor, which makes sense. And a maximum price is a price ceiling. Okay? Okay, so some examples I already mentioned. A minimum wage law is example of a price control, and it is an example of a price floor. That is, a minimum wage law sets a minimum amount that can be paid at an hourly rate for labor, right? Now, rent control is also an example of a price ceiling. Okay? So that is, rent control puts a maximum price. That is, you can't rent apartments for above a certain price, right? And these used to be used in kind of big cities because, as you know, it's expensive to live in big cities. And so low-income people had a hard time affording apartments. And so this was used kind of in the 1950s and 60s. Many cities have kind of gotten rid of these price controls. Basically, the last two cities that still have them are New York City and Berkeley still have some rent-controlled apartments, okay? But that's an example of a price ceiling. It's something that sets a maximum price on rent. The rent can't go higher than a certain amount. Okay. And the last example, and this was kind of gotten rid of in the late 70s, but this is where there were gas price controls. So it mandated a maximum price for gas. So another example of a price ceiling. Now, most of us today don't really remember much of the 1970s, but those price controls on gas in the 1970s that were implemented by Richard Nixon caused some problems. Okay. And so we'll kind of take a look at those. We'll dive into price ceilings first, and then we'll look at price floors and kind of go through and do the analysis.